Deep in the woods, a hiker hears the desperate cries of a dog. He rushes toward the sound, relieved to find the animal alive and seemingly well. But as he rescues the dog, he quickly realizes that this pet has been through something far worse than mere abandonment. The truth behind the dog's escape is more heartbreaking than he ever imagined. Ben Parker had always found peace in the mountains. The quiet rustling of the trees, the sound of a distant creek, and the fresh air, it was everything he needed after a long week at work. This Saturday morning was no different. He had packed his bag, grabbed his hiking boots, and set off on one of his usual trails through the dense forest. He'd been walking for hours, enjoying the solitude, when he heard a faint sound. At first, he thought it was the wind, until the sound grew louder. It was a dog's cry. Ben paused, listening carefully. It was coming from somewhere ahead. Curiosity piqued. Ben started moving in the direction of the sound. The forest around him was thick, with trees that reached high into the sky, and the underbrush was dense with fallen leaves. He had to move cautiously, not wanting to lose track of the cries. As he pushed through the trees, the cries became clearer. He followed them until, finally, he spotted the dog, a medium-sized golden retriever, laying on the ground. The dog was dirty, bruised, and visibly exhausted. Its tail wagged weakly when it saw Ben, but it didn't try to move. Ben knelt down beside the dog, his heart sinking at the sight of its condition. "It's okay, buddy," Ben murmured, gently running his hand through the dog's matted fur. "You're safe now." Ben didn't know how long the dog had been in the woods, but he could tell it had been a while. Its fur was matted and dirty, and it was shaking, though not from the cold, more likely from the trauma it had endured. Ben quickly pulled out a bottle of water from his backpack and offered it to the dog, which lapped it up gratefully. Ben gently coaxed the dog to its feet, watching as it struggled to stand. It looked like it had been through a lot. Its ribs were showing, and its paws were raw from walking long distances through rough terrain. But despite everything, it was still full of life, eager to follow Ben as he stood and began walking slowly. "Come on, boy," Ben said softly, glancing back at the dog. "Let's get you somewhere safe." The dog limped along behind him, its steps slow but determined. Ben was relieved to see it at least trying. He made his way to the nearest clearing, which was just a few hundred yards from the trailhead. There, he sat down on a large rock, carefully helping the dog to lie down beside him. Ben's thoughts raced. How had this dog ended up alone in the wilderness? Had it gotten lost? Abandoned? There were 1,000 questions, but Ben knew one thing for sure. This dog wasn't meant to be out here alone. It needed help, and he was determined to give it. As he sat with the dog, he could see that it was trying to relax now that it was out of the forest. Its breathing had slowed, and its head rested gently on Ben's lap as it seemed to fall into a peaceful sleep. Ben checked his phone for signal, but there was none. The nearest town was about an hour away, so he decided to start the hike back down the mountain. He would take the dog to the nearest animal shelter, where it could get the care it needed. But as he lifted the dog into his arms to start walking, something unexpected happened. The dog whimpered softly, as though it was reluctant to leave the area. Ben froze for a moment, looking down at the dog. He didn't understand why it seemed so attached to the place. It wasn't the kind of behavior he expected from a pet that had just been rescued. As Ben carefully made his way down the trail, the dog's unease grew. It pulled slightly at the leash he had fashioned from his backpack strap, trying to move in a different direction. Ben couldn't make sense of it at first, but he followed the dog's lead, thinking it might just be instinct. The further they walked, the more the dog tugged, looking back toward the deeper forest as though calling it home. Ben started to feel a growing sense of unease himself. It was as if the dog didn't want to leave the woods. It was a strange feeling. Ben had rescued many dogs in his time as a volunteer at local shelters, but none had reacted like this. Usually, they were eager to get away from whatever danger they had faced. But this dog seemed to be longing for something. Ben stopped and knelt down, examining the dog closely. It was acting different than any lost animal he'd ever encountered. The more he thought about it, the more unsettling it became. There was something about the way it looked at the forest, something almost familiar. "Hey," Ben said, his voice quiet. "What's wrong, buddy? You want to go back?" The dog whined softly, looking at him with eyes that seemed full of sadness. And that's when it hit him. This wasn't just any stray. The dog wasn't just lost. It was as if it had a home here, a life, and was torn from it. Ben's heart skipped a beat as the realization started to sink in. What if the dog wasn't lost at all? After a moment of hesitation, Ben made a decision. He would follow the dog's lead. Something told him that there was more to this situation than met the eye. The dog had been through too much, and now, Ben couldn't just ignore its signals. He slowly started to walk back into the forest, the dog leading the way, its pace quickening with each step. Ben followed until they reached a secluded spot deep in the woods, a small, abandoned cabin nestled among the trees. And that's when he saw it. The dog stopped in front of the door and let out a low, mournful bark. Ben's heart pounded as he looked around. The cabin was old, weathered, and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But there was no mistaking it. The dog clearly knew this place. As Ben moved closer, the dog started barking more insistently, pawing at the door. It wasn't a bark of joy. It was almost as if the dog was pleading for Ben to understand something. Ben hesitated for a moment, unsure of what he was walking into. He pushed open the door, which creaked loudly as it swung open. Inside, the cabin was dark and dusty, but it wasn't empty. Ben's eyes immediately fell on a set of old cages stacked in the corner, the remnants of what looked like a former kennel. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. The dog had been here before. Ben stepped further inside, his mind racing. He could see the remnants of a life, a cruel one, by the looks of it. The cages, the food and water bowls that had long since gone dry, and the worn spots on the wooden floor where paws had once tread. This dog hadn't just been lost, it had been kept here, hidden away from the world. But why? Ben looked down at the dog, who had stopped barking and was now sitting quietly, its tail wagging cautiously. It seemed almost at peace now that it was back in this place. But what had driven it to run away in the first place? What was so wrong here that this dog had escaped? The answer came to him in a flash. The cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was a place of captivity. Someone had kept this dog here, probably as a prize, or worse, as part of something far darker. Ben's stomach churned as he realized the dog had likely been part of an underground dog-fighting ring, or worse, used for illegal breeding. As the dog sat silently, Ben realized that it had escaped because it wanted freedom. It wasn't lost, it was escaping from something much more sinister. Ben's mind raced as he stood there in the abandoned cabin, looking around at the evidence of abuse. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. How could anyone do something like this to an innocent creature? But the dog had made it out. It had fought to survive, and now it was in Ben's hands. The first thing he needed to do was get the dog to safety, to get it away from whatever had kept it here. But there was still more to be done. Ben carefully hooked the leash back onto the dog's collar, and with one last look at the cabin, he turned and began the walk back to his car. His thoughts were swirling. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a call to action. He needed to report this place, to make sure it was cleared out, and the people responsible were brought to justice. As he made his way down the trail, he looked down at the dog, who was now walking alongside him, its head held high. There was a sense of peace in the air, a feeling that the dog had finally found its freedom. Ben promised himself that he wouldn't let this go. The dog's escape wasn't just an accident, it was a plea for help, and he couldn't ignore it. This was just the beginning of a fight that he was now a part of, one that would ensure no animal would ever have to suffer like this again.